Well, hanging out with me today is Mark. Mark, say your last name for me because I'm going to butcher it.
Lutz.
Lutz.
You got it. Yeah.
Dude,
But
perfect.
you can call me Lutz, Lutz. It doesn't. It's none of the above will offend me.
See, now that you've said it so many different ways, I'm going to say it wrong so many different ways.
Well, you can say it all the ways. Yeah. It got mispronounced at my wedding, so don't even fret.
Perfect. Dude, okay, so before we even get into this, now that you brought that up, I have to tell you. So a buddy of mine asked me to perform his wedding, right?
Yeah.
And the entire time that I've known him, I realized that I had never said his last name before. And
Wow.
I'm sitting there
Close
at the
friends.
altar.
Close friends.
Yep, close friends. Look, you're close friends when you know each other on first name basis only, okay? Come on now. And so we're standing there, and I've got his soon-to-be bride on this side. He's on this side of me, and I'm looking at my notes, and I just kind of went, oh, dude, I'm going to have to full send this thing and just hope that I say this right. Luckily, I did, but it was just one of those like, dude, I've seen your last name so many times in texts or emails or whatever that I just made the assumption that I know how to say it, but I don't know that I actually know how to say it. And for everybody who's listening or watching, let me just say, while performing a wedding ceremony, that is not the time to be questioning whether or not you actually know how to pronounce somebody's name, like Mark Lutz.
Yeah. No, you got it. You got it. Yeah. No, weddings are they're like the only time that I'm actually nervous to speak in front of people. Like I can pretty much get through anything else, but on a wedding day, like, you as a pastor, you want to do that well, right? Like you want to make sure that you do that really, really good. So it's the only thing that I ever read. Like I never read when I preach, but
Yeah.
like for a wedding day, I do a little bit more like actually reading my manuscript.
Yep, I get it. So with that being said, Mr. I only do manuscript for weddings. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing in this crazy thing called life.
Yeah, man. Well, I have first off my family. I have a wife named Jen, who is a preschool teacher, and then I have two little girls, Brooklyn, who is 6, and Ari, who is 4. Her full name's Aria. And my wife and I worked. I worked for a church for 11 years. I graduated from college with a youth ministry degree. Grabbed a youth min gig and ran that for about 6 years. Saw a lot of fruit out of that, which was just a really great season, a really good season of life. Got married during that season, had our first child during that season. And then at the tail end of that, ended up transitioning, staying at the same church, but transitioning to head of discipleship, assimilation, and care for our church, and overseeing our youth ministry, our children's ministry, and our local missions and outreach folks. And so I ran that area of our church for about 5 years. And then it was sometime in there, about 2019, there was some pretty clear signs. And when every former youth pastor tells you there's some pretty clear signs that they're to move on, they would love to over spiritualize that for the most part and just say the Lord was just leading me to something new. And to a certain extent, that was true. But in my stubborn heart, the best way to lead me to something that was true was to put me through substantial enough pain to get me to realize that it was time to move on. And so I was locking horns with leadership, and it was just it was an uncomfortable situation that I was in, and it was a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but mostly me. And luckily, the church that my wife works for as a preschool teacher is the church that I worked for 11 years. So we have phenomenal relationships there, and it was not a bad break. It was a really good situation. And it was sort of during that season, that 2019-ish, that I really felt compelled that my wife and I were supposed to do something new. And I really began praying through, and there's a long story of sort of like a slow and arduous stubbornness in my heart towards calling, that resulted in us ultimately in 2021 and in 2020 planning and then planting an entirely digital church inside the online gaming community. And so since March of 21, but really in my heart since about August of 2020. We've been leading Lux, Lux, not my last name. I have to give that disclaimer. Lux is the Latin word for light. We pulled that from Matthew chapter 5. You're the light of the world. Lux Digital Church. And so we've been reaching gamers all across the globe and a lot of non-gamers, to be perfectly honest with you. More than you would expect, people who don't game or who are casual gamers. We planted our church. Our sanctuary is on a platform called twitch.tv, which is a website formerly known as justin.tv. Ended up getting bought by Amazon a handful of years ago. So now Jeff Bezos makes all that cash. It owns the vast majority of live streaming on the internet. And when I say that, I don't mean Netflix live streaming, like watching something. I mean, like, I am live on the internet talking in real time with you who is watching in real time, right? And obviously that type of environment has its own. If anybody remembers the Periscope app when it came out, that was able to exist for about 7 days before debauchery erupted on it. And so you can just imagine, the type of field and world that we get the opportunity to plant our church in and live in. And then the rest of our church exists on a platform called Discord, which is basically a community building platform. And it's used by the Twitch community to really produce, curate content, but then also to allow creators to draw closer to their communities. We use that as the base in which we exist as a church for all things discipleship, community, small groups, Bible studies, hangout nights, our version of the church potluck. All of those sorts of things all happen over on Discord. And like I said, we'll be celebrating 3 years here in a couple of months. So it's been a wild ride.
Yeah. And from what I remember when you and I got connected because we were both speaking at a conference, doing a workshop for really like a metaverse church and gaming church.
Yeah, which I don't belong in, by the way, because I'm not a metaverse guy. I mean, I have a headset. Like, I know, like, Stuart, you're like the Lakeland metaverse guy, right? But I have been in a Lakeland campus before, and I've been to a couple of VR services before, but I am not a VR, virtual reality pastor in that way.
Yeah, so let's come back to that in a second because I'm curious as to why. And I'm sure many people who are listening are just going to go, aren't they basically the same thing? So we'll dive into that in a second. But what caught my attention was when you and I like officially connected. Like, we have heard each other's names through the grapevine. Like, we have been connected with mutual friends, but you and I had never actually connected. So you and I are down in Orlando in March of 2023 for Exponential. And we are doing 2 different workshops, same room, same, track, this idea of metaverse gaming. And so we went to a connection dinner, something like that, for, I think it was Stadia, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we really got connected. And they're playing this awesome video just introducing Mark and Lux Digital Church to the rest of this church planting community. And I'm watching this video, and one of the things that stood out to me was your story of you guys were thinking about planting a physical church, moving in that direction, then decided to shift completely to digital, which in 2019, as you're saying that, nobody is thinking that direction yet.
Not
because
yet.
because COVID hasn't really become
There's
a
a
thing
couple
yet.
of us, but not many of us.
Right. And so the idea of even going to like a church planting agency and saying, hey, we want to plant a church that is fully digital, they must have been scratching their heads if it was 2019, if you're having that conversation. I'm guessing that conversation happened during COVID.
Yeah. So in 2019, it was summertime. So I launched a podcast and began to just use that as an opportunity to reach people in a very niche card game community. I'm a card gamer. That's like my gaming preference. And it was kind of through that I began to evangelize and disciple people. And so I was a firm believer that the digital church expression was very likely sort of heretical. And so I was not a guy. I was a micro church guy. I told people all the time, I play video games to get away from people, not to connect with people.
Mm,
Despite being a gamer my whole life, I'm actually primarily a tabletop gamer. I'm a Dungeons and Dragons player, board game player. I actually suck at video games. I do enjoy them. I'm just not good at them. And so, God moving us in that direction was certainly, and in many ways, right? Then this is very clear all across the internet, right? It's the area of my greatest weakness as well. Like the internet has
mm,
always been an area in which I need to be extremely cautious with where I'm at and how I use it. And I've
mm,
had a history of addictive behavior, both in what you would expect in the internet and then also in video game addiction and escapism. And so for
mm,
me to be called into the lion's den, into a realm of weakness, for me seemed very strange as somebody who had been completely off of social media, all those sorts of things. And so when I tell you that it took a while for the Holy Spirit to really move us in this way, I did not step into this, lightly. It was with a ton of caution and a lot of arguments with God over the course of about 3 months, that
mm,
I finally, in early March of 2020, came to my pastor and said, I think we're supposed to plan an online church. And I laid out everything on this like 15-foot whiteboard as to what that was going to look like. And at the time, it was sort of a mix between a church and a missions organization. It's become more churchy at launch than what it was originally. And it was then that my pastor said, I think God is in this. And yeah, I
mm.
think he really did genuinely think that God was in it. And then I also think he was like, oh, thank goodness Mark figured out where God wants him to be because he's staying here. And so, that conversation went really well. He left literally the following day or the following week for India, on a church planting missions trip. And the day that he came back, like the next morning, our state shut down churches for COVID.
Mm.
And so he got into the country just in time, and we backburnered everything. So it was in our heart, and we sort of spoke it out about a week, 2 weeks before COVID-19 actually hit. And then it was in 2020 in August that we actually called Stadia and said, hey, we're thinking about planning a church. We're thinking a fully digital church. Would that be something you'd be willing to entertain? I knew Stadia existed because our worship pastor had been there for 13 years, was in the
Mm,
process of planting a church through Stadia, and he had done all the research. And I was really interested in church planting. I wanted to plant sort of a micro church expression. And so, he had talked to Ark, he had talked to Vineyard, he had talked to Stadia. He made the final choice to go with Stadia. And so,
mm,
like, I was already sort of like thinking that's a direction that I might want to go if I was ever to plant a church. And I had called like Start Church and different organizations and been having some conversations with them about what that might look like. It just so happened that Stadia's president, Greg Nettle, had come back from sabbatical that year. And when he came back, he said, we need to start planning entirely digital churches. And
mm.
when he said that, it was in like October of 2019. So now we're in August of 2020, and they had finally finished building a discovery process, or kind of like a vetting process, which a lot of church planners go through for digital church planters. And they had hired someone to help run that area, and they were launching their first discovery, like, meetup or whatever, online, a couple of weeks after I called them. And it usually takes a couple of months to get through sort of all the discovery process. But we just burnt through it. My wife and I churned through all that stuff, went through all of the psyche, all that sort of stuff, and then joined the discovery process. And so we, along with two other couples, were like the first ones to kind of get the thumbs up from Stadia that, like, hey, we think that you can plan a fully digital church. We were the first to launch, not the only to launch. There was one other. And so Chris and Christy lead Relate Church on Facebook. And
Mm.
so the other church never made it to launch. But we and Relate did.
Yeah, that's crazy. And here's the thing. So this was what caught my attention, especially with that video and your guys' partnership with Stadia. And I'm pretty sure you and I have talked about this before, but it's just the idea of, church planting organizations and church planters will raise up hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to get a church up off the ground in a physical location. And what I heard from your story was you guys basically said to Stadia, we can reach more people with a fraction of the cost. Here is the basic setup that we need. Is this something that you guys want to go after? And clearly is something that, mutually with God being in the center of it, you guys chased after. And here we are 3 years later, 4 years later, still going after it. So what has the reach been like for you guys? Because somebody who's listening to this who hasn't played around in the digital field at all or gaming community, like what you've been talking about, they might sit there and say, well, yes, this is a very unique crowd. This is definitely a niche. Like, is there an actual reach component? Because you said in there, and what you were just talking about, like it's now more churchy than it is missional, but there was definitely probably at the very beginning aspect of it, it was more missional than it was anything else. So what's the reach been like? What does that look like? And how has that impact been for you guys these past few years?
Yeah. Let me unpack a couple things there. Let's unpack the money side of it first. And so when we planted Lux, we thought of ourselves as a church plant, not as a live stream. And we raised funds according to what we wanted to be. And so I think a lot of people who are getting into the digital space right now specifically are like, and there's a lot of this in the space. It's like, it's super cheap. Buy a $300 headset and you can be a VR church. And to a certain extent, that's true. But if you want to be taken seriously and you want people to know that you operate with excellence, it doesn't just take a couple $100s. Like, you're not going to go and grab a cheap USB mic, a webcam, throw up a live stream on Twitch, and be like, I'm reaching gamers. So when we thought about how we were planning at church, first off, we knew this had to have my full time. This wasn't a part-time gig. So I needed to raise enough for a salary. Second off, we knew this wasn't going to exist in our house because it would drive my wife nuts and we didn't have the space. So we knew we needed to build a studio. And so, yes, what we were doing was cheaper than what it would have been like to plant a church in LA or New York City, but it might actually be more expensive than what it would cost you to plant a church in a really rural area or like in the hills of West Virginia. Right.
Yeah.
And so just to give you an idea, our year one budget was 125 grand. That was our goal. We raised that and we built a studio. Now, the physical cost for a lot of churches might be 100K just to get speakers, lights, projector, a vehicle to transport all of your tables and chairs in. And you might then be able to operate with a service, but it's not going to be the best service in town, right? Like, people aren't going to come because of your level of excellence. They might come because of your heart. They might come because you're scrappy. They might come because you're relational, but there's probably going to be a bigger church in your town that's doing what you're doing better than what you're doing. For us, we spent 40K on building a studio from a room above my garage that was just studs and a wood floor that you could see through. We built a really nice studio. We got nice equipment, not crazy equipment. You know, we're not sitting on $20,000 cameras. We're on Blackmagic Pocket 4Ks for, $1,400-1,500 a pop, right? Not super cheap, not super expensive. They're not $70 webcams. However, in that 40K, we're able to put ourselves in probably easily the top 1% in terms of excellence in what we're doing in like the shots that we're able to get, the audio quality that we're able to get on Twitch. And so we're able to be really, really excellent inside that 40K. And so when we launched, it was not cheap for us to launch. Like, I don't want to give the impression that it's like it costs nothing. The benefit of the digital church, right, is that it scales really, really well. So most of our overhead is almost always going to be in two areas: missions, and then it's going to be in staffing. So we'll have staff, but because my staff isn't local all the time, like one of my pastors is in Tampa, and he's never moving up here, right? He has a studio in Tampa. We have a studio here in Pennsylvania. We're capable of being like really mobile and really efficient with the way that we spend our money, which enables us to give more and more away. So just in, year 3, like this last year, 2023, we were able to move in the first couple of years of our ministry to giving probably more than 20% of what came in away. Like, we gave it into missions. We launched a child sponsorship program in Uganda. I began taking teams to Uganda in order to do missions with orphans over there. And so our heartbeat is like, we can scale really, really large theoretically. And our overhead doesn't scale with it, right? It's not like, okay, now we have a mortgage payment. Now we have a facilities director. Now we need a janitor service. Like, none of that stuff comes into play with us. Like, we hire a cleaning person once a year, and I haven't even hired them yet this year to come into the studio and do a deep clean, right? And that's about it. So scalability and stuff is there, but I don't want people to come in and think like, oh, $150 I can pop in this and like I can get involved in this as well. it takes money in order to do something with a high level of excellence. Now let's talk about reach really quick. So Twitch, as a platform, pre 2020 was seeing over 100 million unique viewers a month, a little over 3.5 million broadcasters. And so just to give you an idea, it is not a small platform. It is absolutely massive. It is one of the biggest, if not the biggest mission fields, one of the biggest cities that you can go to on the planet just in this platform alone. Statistics show that there's about 3.02, that's probably lowballing it, billion people who identify as a gamer on the planet. We're not just talking about people who pop up like your mom who pops up and plays a little bit of Candy Crush, right? These are people who identify themselves as gamers. 3.02 billion is roughly a billion more gamers than there are Christians, and the gaming population is growing faster than any other area. It's about $390 billion in the gaming industry every year. And that's what it's worth, right? And so it's roughly 3.5 times bigger than the movie industry. Like
Wow.
just like if you think like in your church environment, right? How much maybe a Marvel movie or maybe Netflix or maybe Apple TV, whatever, has an impact on sort of like the beliefs and the thoughts and the worldview of the people, you know, that call your church home. Just imagine that video games actually have about a 3.7-ish, something like that, percent, or 3.7 times bigger impact on the population roughly than what movies likely do. And there's no easy way to say exactly what that correlation is. I'm just saying, like, in terms of size of industry, it is not a small industry and you can't just throw it off, right? There are now lots of professional video game players that are seeing higher payouts for what they're doing than we're seeing professional athletes get. We're seeing professional video games, largely because of Asian countries, that are seeing much larger audiences than what any professional sport is seeing. We're seeing, just unbelievable numbers when it comes to people who have eyes on this industry, and that industry continues to grow. And so as the church continues to be like, that's a kid's thing, what they don't realize is the average hardcore gamer is 35 years old. He's actually my age, right? I'm almost 36. The average hardcore gamer is 35. And so this is not just a kid's thing. In fact, if you're looking for the lost generation of millennial males and you don't know where they went, I can tell you where they are. I know exactly where they are. I've met tons of them. People who've left the church with no intention. We always say our church is built to be able to reach people who would rather go to hell than go to church. And then if you're also thinking that it's mostly just a bunch of guys sitting in their parents' basements playing video games, actually it's 51-49 or like 52-48 in terms of men to women in the gaming world right now.
Wow.
And so it's actually a pretty even and accurate split with it's actually a more accurate split of male to female than what church attendance is. Whereas church attendance errs on the side of women, the video game industry actually is almost evenly split. And so, like, the statistics do not lie that the church has to really be so when you're talking about reach, right, it's almost infinite, like in terms of the number of people that we have the opportunity to interact with, the number of people that we could potentially reach, the growth that you could potentially see, and then the financial overhead and burden for that growth really just lands on how fast can we build teams that can actually disciple people. Because Jesus didn't come and then leave and say, hey, I want you to go out into all the world and make live streams. He said, I want you to go and make disciples. And so it's not just on us to go make live streams, it's on us to make disciples. And the biggest thing that holds our church back is not like, how do we grow? It's like one of the things that we've talked about is unsustainable, unhealthy growth. We actually are very happy that we don't use social media to advertise at all. We don't like pay for ads anywhere. We grow organically. Our server went from nothing in the last 3 years. Our Discord server, we just popped over 700 people. This year, we just crested 3,100 people that have been part of one of our streams throughout the course of this 2023, not since we started, just in the course of the last 11 and a half months. We've seen over 3,100 people who've been impacted in one way or another by our live stream. We've seen well over 1,000 people over the course of this last year that have been engaged in a live stream at one point or another. In terms of like actually typing in chat, we actually just looked at stats, so like wondering, well, what is the thing? And we could do this at our church. Like we do an online service at our church. Our church is completely different than what you might see in an online service. We're much more of a mix of a Twitch culture and a church kind of blended together, which gets to this missional impact. So just to give you an idea, Twitch just gave us our stats for 2023. Our church has seen 61.2 thousand messages sent inside of a chat. 61.2 thousand messages just in 2023. And so to give you an idea of like, what does the engagement actually look like? A lot of times you're having one service a week, 52 times a year, maybe you're doing an online service. You might see 10 or 15 messages that go out during one of your live services, right? Our service is seeing like anywhere between like 125 to 150 people who are popped in at least at some point during the service. And then we're seeing about 75 to 80 who are like actively engaged in terms of our average attendance. So if you think like we're not seeing thousands of people in a service, but we're also not seeing 15 messages in a service. We're seeing over 60,000 messages throughout the course of the year. So the engagement is there in terms of it looks completely different than what you would typically think of when you think of an online church experience. We're relationship-based first, not platform-based. And so a lot of the reason that people are attending our church and are finding a home with us is because we have intentionally built in spaces. Everything that we do drives people towards relationship with us. And actually, Stuart, a lot of the church that when we launched in March of 2020 or 2021 rather, it actually looked super churchy, like from the get-go. And there's actually an intentionality around that. And so the person that we're trying to reach is a de-churched person, not a completely unchurched person. I know in VR world, like you get a lot more of that because you have a lot of people who are like sort of early tech adopters, not necessarily heavy gamers. Maybe they are, but certainly some tech adopters, people who like, I have a guy in my small group, Zockstrat, who is a VR dude, like every single day has the full bodysuit, like the whole deal, right? Wow. And, for him, he's a full-blown atheist, does not want to engage in prayer or with God really much at all. So like we don't run into as much of that. And I've never been that person, right? So I can't connect to or relate to that person. I grew up inside the church. I had a season where I walked away. But for me, like the church has always been a second home. And so for us, we knew when we launched that the person we were trying to reach was the de-churched person. And we also knew that our church was to serve as a bridge between digital church expressions, which can often feel very foreign and very weird to the average physical church pastor. And we were supposed to serve as a bridge between physical churches and legacy pastors, boomers and Xers who are coming into their legacy years, who are trying to wrap their mind around digital space. We were serving as a bridge between them and also digital space. We're kind of a translator, right? Because I speak both of those languages, working in the physical church and now leading a digital church. And so our church has always looked and been structured a little more like a church than what maybe a lot of people would typically think of or would imagine, but it is less like a church than what the average, online service might look like in terms of what you would experience if you went to a church. It's more of a blend between, we call it a just chatting stream, which if you're confused, like, man, people are just coming to play video games. What are you doing playing video games during church to connect with them? The largest category on Twitch, pretty much 24/7, is a category called just chatting, which is exactly what you would think. It is people just chatting. And so at any given time, 24/7, there's 300 to 500,000 people who are watching a just chatting stream. Wow. And so, for example, like this year, we were in the top 1% in terms of like the size of our community, the top 1% of just chatting streams in 2023, which is really incredible statistic because we're a church, a place, something that's typically pretty unwelcome on Twitch, pretty hostile towards Christians, pretty hostile towards churches in general. And so like, I say all of that because we are missional in terms of our impact and in terms of the way that we're doing things, but we do have some things that look like a church because the average de-churched person, for us, the person we're trying to reach left church at 12, right, hasn't been back since, all that sort of stuff. When they come in, they need some things that are different enough that it's intriguing. And then it's like, okay, I'll check this out, but familiar enough that they don't think we're a cult.
Mm,
And so, or think that we're making a mockery of what a church is, right? Because there are a lot of people on
mm,
Twitch who are making a mockery or have a false church, right? There's like an AI Jesus that's up 24/7 that you can just go and type in chat GPT generates stuff, and then he speaks it back to you, that sort of stuff. We want to make sure that we're not making a mockery of it, like we're serious about what we do. And so things like the Lord's Supper and baptisms, a time of prayer, a time of worship, an actual sermon that's usually, most people think, hey, you can't preach for any longer than 15 minutes online. People won't pay attention. Our services at Lux are almost always at least an hour and a half, and I preach usually for 35 to 40 minutes.
wow.
Very rarely are we in the short, but a lot of my people are sitting and watching Twitch for hours every day, right? Like it's not uncommon. Like this is their form of television and entertainment. They don't watch a lot of TV and things. Like they are on Twitch every day. And so for us, that is just part of the culture that we've leaned into, that this live stream is a little bit slower paced. It's not quite as programmatic. And we sort of are able to move with the spirit. And we don't need to have multiple services. We can fit any number of people in one. So then we don't
Mm,
have to, shuffle people out of a parking lot by a certain time to get them ready for the next service. So it gives us a little bit more flexibility as an online space.
yeah, for sure. So I got two questions. I'm gonna try my best to remember both of them, but I'll start with this one. Um, for anybody that's listening to this who is a person on staff at a church someplace or is a senior pastor, like you started touching on it, the live stream services don't nearly have the same reach impact that you guys are experiencing. So, what is like the key difference in there? Like, what is the X factor? Like, because you said it, like it's streaming, right? Like, what you guys do is streaming. It's a chat based streaming for the most
Mm-hmm.
part. What is different than a church that's using like the church online platform or using YouTube or Facebook, um, that's not experiencing the same kind of reach that you guys are?
I mean, there are a lot of things that are at the heart of it. It is the decision to be a relationship first, relational first ministry rather than platform first ministry. And I think every church planting pastor
Hmm.
or senior pastor understands this, right? They know that relational ministry is central and important to building the church that they're in, and they do that every single day of their life. How like they build relationships with people. That's what they do. They invest in people's lives. They invest in their staff. Their staff invests in people. Their staff invest in volunteers. There's volunteers invest in people from their church, right? There's that sort of downward thing. However, when it comes to online space, for whatever reason during COVID, we just never asked the question, how do we do relationships? We just asked, how do we build a platform? And so that's all that really the church has been interested in, is platform-based ministry. And so there's never an opportunity for you to welcome people into the space. So I say this a lot. The online space is a two-way street, and the church thinks it's only one way. They think it's just a way for them to tell their story. And they don't understand that the most powerful part of the online space is the other side of the street. It's your ability to hear somebody else's story, anybody else's story from anywhere in the world, any time of the day.
Hmm.
And the church just hasn't gotten that. And so churches just use their Instagram page not as a place to connect and invite people into relationship, but just as a place to advertise their most recent upcoming event. And so I'm sorry, like I've never and then we're like, why aren't we getting engagement, and why aren't we getting life impact, and our online ministry isn't working and digital isn't real? Well, I don't know about you, but Stuart, I've never gone to a church and I've never walked in and saw a bulletin board that had a poster for trunk or treat on it, and then someone wrote a note underneath that said, this poster just changed my life, and tacked it underneath. But we expect that to happen on Instagram, right? Well, we want engagement, we want life change. Well, let's post about our upcoming event so that people know how to get here. And like, you're never inviting people into relationship. There's a lot of other like nuance that's very different. So for example, we started from the beginning, I don't have a physical audience. I don't preach to a group of people. Audience is a bad word, but I don't have there's no physical congregation. We're in a 30-foot by 17-foot sound treated room. I have a stream director, an audio director, a video director, and my wife usually. Like there's 4 or 5 of us, a worship leader maybe, right, who's in the studio. I am unapologetically 100% teaching to, ministering to, and connecting to people who are in our chat, who are in our live stream. And just be very clear, every person who comes to church on a Sunday morning, when your pastor cannot see the chat and cannot interact, and the most that they do is get on stage and say, want to welcome everybody who's part of our online campus this week. And then you never acknowledge them again. And at the end, the stream director throws up a see you next week family slide that you downloaded from somewhere. Like, do not be surprised that people's lives aren't changed. Do not be surprised that people become consumeristic. And as a pastor, don't get mad that people are consumeristic. You are taking the most consumeristic product that you make, your Sunday morning service, and that is all that you are making available to people online. So do not be mad when all that you're offering is consumeristic things that your church becomes more consumeristic. If you want them to become less consumeristic, you have to stop giving them consumeristic products. And so, like, in terms of the church, like, we're getting exactly what we're putting out there. Like, the physical church is getting exactly what they're advertising. In fact, they're actually very good at it. Like, unfortunately, you're not using either the right bait or the right tools, because it isn't what you want. Like you're saying, in the church world, we're saying what we want is engagement. What we want is life transformation. What we want is connection and community online. We want all of those things, but we're not using any of the tools that we literally already have and have built churches with historically. We're not using any of those tools in order to get there. For the most part, there's exceptions to that rule, right? Lakeland's an exception to that rule. There's lots of churches that are doing that and doing it well and actually seeing a great deal of success and life transformation and baptisms and salvations with people all over the world. It is happening. Just the most physical churches, it's not happening in. And you see a lot of pastors now are just like, well, just get them back to the church, right? We just need to get people back in church. And most of those people, like, they just end up never coming back to church. Right? If you say that online enough, eventually those people are like, well, you're not here for me. And I'm not coming back to your building. So see ya, or I can't come back to your building. Like, I literally can't. I moved away, or whatever have you. And so I think it's just really discouraging to me when I see pastors who are well-meaning, who just, they're intimidated by or nervous about or don't really know how to handle the digital space. And so then their response is like, I don't know, just let's just use it because I know we have to. But just use it improperly. I think that causes more confusion than anything else.
Yeah, man, that's good. That's really good. I sit there and I've pondered on that because I've obviously seen what you guys have been doing, and I've been asking the question, like, how do we bring that over to Lakeland? Because your guys' reach and your engagement is obviously way off the charts. And for me, that's what I want to see. Is I want to see the engagement for our online community to just skyrocket. But to your point, like, that's just the case. You're moving in a direction, whether you realize it or not, and what it is that you're producing is going to give you the results of what you're actually producing, right? You're either, like, if you don't have the focus, like the right focus on what you're wanting to achieve, and you're just doing something because it's the easiest thing to do, the easy thing is probably not going to get you there. So, man, I love it. So here's my second question for you. So you got a team. You were looking at micro originally, before you got into doing Lutz. Your reach is massive. Like you said, you don't have a physical building, so you can continue to gather people, part of your Twitch stream. So is there a plan ever to, I guess the right word would be multiply, as in, like, launch more Lutz digital churches? And I asked this question for this reason. It was one of the issues that I faced as the VR campus pastor for Lakeland, right? Like, to me, if people are driving down the physical streets here in Lake Geneva and they're going through a crisis moment and they don't know where to turn because of where we are placed in our community, you're probably going to pass by our church building at some point in time. And you might not have any faith background whatsoever, but if you're facing a crisis moment, there's a good chance that you're going to pass by the building and go, maybe somebody in there has an answer for the despair that I'm facing right now. And so I started asking the question, how does Lakeland become the VR version of our in real life expression, where we are the street corner church, that if somebody's going through a crisis, they know, hey, go to Lakeland VR and meet with a pastor or somebody that's a part of that church. Really hard to be the church for virtual reality when you're only there for 1 to 2 hours a week.
Sure.
Like our building is just not open 1 or 2 hours a week. Our building's not just open for our services. So I asked that question, like, is there a plan for Lux to multiply, to launch more, to go micro so the reach is further? Or is this like the proper direction, like the way you guys are currently doing it?
That's a great question. Well, I think first thing to point out is that we are not like, there's a slight difference between us and a VR campus in the fact that Twitch is our sanctuary, but Discord is every other place in our church, and Discord is never closed. And so our church is literally 24/7. And so I'm getting DMs from people every day, all day. And our pastors are as well. And so like that exists. Now, in terms of like vision for the future and what does that look like? Absolutely. So we see ourselves planting in a couple of theoretically different ways. And so let's talk about gaming churches first. So for us, what it would look like to plant another online gaming church, we look at it as planting in sort of like neighborhoods. And so if you don't know much about the gaming world has very different genres, right? And so if you are a simulation gamer, you're playing, Euro Truck gamer, you're like literally pretending to drive a truck throughout your day, right? That's the game that you play, or a flight simulator, right? That's a very specific group of people. If you're a racing gamer, specific group of people. First person shooter player, group of people. MMO player, that's a group of people. Card gaming, group of people. Like we planted our church out of a card gaming community, and that is actually seen through our team. We have a lot of people who are very intelligent because the game that we planted out of is very cerebral. Like, and so like that actually colors a lot of the stuff that we do as a church. And also because we planted out of a card gaming community, a lot of our people were also tabletop gamers because they started card gaming in Magic the Gathering back when they were in middle school or elementary school, and that was a tabletop game. And so we lean into that pretty heavily. In fact, we have a Dungeons and Dragons ministry outreach at our church where we run games for people. We have in the background of all of our shots, if you look at me right now, these are all board games in the back of our shots. That's in the back of every single service. We have board games in the back of our shots because our community connects with that deeply. A first-person shooting community or a MOBA community would not connect with that in the same way. And those communities are massive and worthy of churches. And so theoretically, we could plant churches that are also online churches that are geared towards reaching a very different type of gamer. And so let's say we would plant a church in the League of Legends community or in the first person shooter community. And those churches would take on very different characteristics from the church that I lead right now. The next thing is planting churches in other digital platforms. So we look at other digital platforms, we ask questions. Can this actually be a church? When I look at Acts chapter 2, I see that the church exhibited 5 to 6 key devotions. In there, the word devotion in Greek is steadfast continuing. And so the first church steadfastly continued in certain things. So the church is not a building. The church is not the church isn't a building. The church is not just a people group, right? Because if it was just a building, the gym could be a church. If it's just a people group, then a coffee shop could be a church. And it isn't just a Bible study either, right? It's something more than that. So when we look at Acts chapter 2, we see that the church steadfastly continued in the apostles' teachings, in the sacraments, in prayer, in community, in generosity, and in worship. And so we look at platforms and say, can we exist and steadfastly continue in these 5 or 6 things? I say 5 because we don't always include worship, because I think the modern evangelical version of worship limited to song singing ends up creating more confusion than it does helping people. So though we have 5, we just take worship out of ours. So although we do worship together, those things, can we do those things well and biblically inside of the platform? And so, for example, Instagram, we can't. There's no ability to build genuine community there. Facebook, we could. YouTube, we might be able to, if you can get a community hub page, right, where you can begin connecting with people and pulling them to a different platform. And so when we look at these platforms, we ask, do they have the tools that can be used to plant a church? If they do, we actually don't use those platforms right now because I won't use them until we're ready to plant a church there. It's not just an advertising page for me. If we have a platform that doesn't have the tools, then we actually do use those as a church billboard or a place to invite people into community, right? It's not the place we're generating community, but it is a place that we're inviting people in. So Instagram and TikTok, for example, don't have the tools that are robust enough to plant a church. So we use those platforms a lot right now in order to invite people into our already established church. Whereas on Facebook, we don't do hardly anything there because one day we might send a pastor and a team to plant a Lux Digital Church on Facebook. And we will use groups and pages, which is a robust enough set of tools to actually live out all of what I believe to be the 5 or 6 primary devotions of a church. Then from there, our third heart and vision in terms of multiplication is micro church planting. And these are physical expressions of the church that we can plant literally anywhere. And so the long-term goal of Lux Digital Church is to say, as God sends us apostolic leaders, we actually invite them into discipling relationships where we encourage them to evangelize and reach the people in their own communities, and then plant micro churches of 5 to 12 people that have multiplication DNA baked into them, where they are going to multiply and plant more and more churches in their city and their community. This allows us to plant micro house church movements inside of any language, any culture, anywhere on the globe, and then link them all together to a much larger digital family through a web that gives them resources and discipleship tools and all of the tools that they need to properly minister to their micro church expression, and then also allows their micro church expression to connect to a much larger global body. So yeah, they have 10 to 12 people that they're in community with, living life with, and being the church with every day, but then they also have several thousand people that are connected to a much larger online digital community, digital church expression that they're able to build relationship with, get connected to, be discipled by, all of those sorts of things. And so if I look to the future of Lux, I see us having 3 or 4 house churches in Moscow, some in South Africa, and then scattered, all across the United States, Canada, anywhere, Australia, that we have these micro house church multiplying expressions that are popping up all over the place. I think that when people hear that, their natural inclination is to say, well, then you're not an entirely digital church. And you're right. But the next generation doesn't need entirely digital churches. They need churches that understand how to live hybridly. I say all the time that the coming generations are hybrid but holistic, and we are hybrid but dualistic, meaning that if you can remember when the internet started, you likely also remembered recreating yourself online. Because you immediately, when you saw the internet, you're like, oh, I could be anything that I want to be here. And so you immediately split yourself and you became 2 people, one digital, one physical. And you don't even like the person that you are digitally, truth be told. And so that's why you're against digital. But the coming generations, my daughters, for example, are holistic people. In other words, they've experienced the internet since birth. And the internet has been the most life-changing thing for the past 3 generations, right? Xers and boomers were already like mature and in their careers in many cases before the internet became an interruption. Millennials like me remember getting the internet, remember dial-up, all of those things, and our lives are forever changed. But Gen Z and Alpha and beyond will never remember a life when the internet, they didn't have access to high-speed internet. And so because of that, their life is just radically different in terms of the way that they use the internet. They're actually far more prone to be who they are online than previous generations have been, because they grew up and the YouTube algorithm was learning who they were as they were learning who they are. And so they have a much more organic, natural, and holistic digital expression. And so they don't see the difference between physical and digital relationships, right? Those are just friends. They don't look and say, well, these people are online. This guy could be a 30-year-old or 40-year-old axe murderer and not the person I think that they are. They don't think in that way. Are they cautious? Are they careful with how they use the internet? Most of the time, yes, like they're really actually extremely savvy. If you look at people who misuse the internet, it's almost always people who are 50 and up, because they just don't have the skill set to learn and discern when they're being tricked, when something is false, when information's good, what's a good site, what's a bad site, that sort of thing. Whereas the next generation coming up, my daughter who's 6 already has a lot of the tools that she needs to navigate a digital and hybrid world really, really well. And so she'll grow up in that world. The point is that our churches have to learn how to become hybrid and holistic. And right now we are hybrid and dualistic. And if we do not learn how to be hybrid and holistic, both digital and physical expressions seamlessly moving between one and the next, we're going to really, really struggle to reach the next generations.
Yeah, dude, so good. Like that's almost like a sound bite right there for an introduction to a podcast that will be coming out soon. Way to go, Mark. That was good. All right, so we'll wrap this up, but you keep talking about tabletop games, card games. You kept mentioning Dungeons and Dragons. So the funny part is, I have been thrusted into a world that I never imagined that I would be a part of. I am not a gamer whatsoever. You put
Yep.
a board game in front of me. I'm going to figure out as quickly as I possibly can how I can destroy you at it. Am I going to like seek out playing a card game with somebody? No, not me. The last video game console I ever had was an Xbox 360 that I bought primarily to play Blu-ray discs when that was all the rage. So you are speaking a language and you are reaching to people and you are doing things that I never would have dreamt of doing. But what I love about what you're doing is you have found a passion of yours, combined it with a purpose that God has given you, and you have carried the banner of Jesus into those spaces in order to just love on people well and introduce people to Jesus. And that's what I absolutely love about what you guys are doing. All that being said, how come you've never come out to Lake Geneva since we've been connected? This is the birthplace of Dungeons and Dragons, bro.
That's a good question. That's a good question. Okay, so Lake Geneva, Stuart, are you in Ohio, like near Geneva on the lake? Is that where
Wisconsin.
you are? Wisconsin.
Yep.
Okay. I actually didn't even know what the birthplace of Dungeons and Dragons is, to be entirely honest with you. You would think I would know that. False gamer here. I know a lot about D&D. I've been playing D&D since I was in 6th grade. But that's a great question, man. I mean, that would be a great tour. Come out, hang out in Lakeland, and I don't know, maybe is there like a shrine or something? Like, this is where the first D&D game was played.
To be honest with you, I don't even know. I think I heard rumors maybe like a year ago that they're looking at building a museum, or maybe there is a museum. I don't know. But yeah, and here's the only reason why I know this. I don't know that D&D was born and birthed out of here because of this is where we're living. I kid you not. I found out about it because my wife and I started watching Big Bang Theory after we moved out here to Wisconsin.
Okay. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And there's an episode where Sheldon's like, they're in a bet or something, or they're trying to make a deal, and Sheldon's like, but if I win, you have to take me to Lake Geneva, where Dungeons and Dragons was born out of. And my wife and I just went,
hold up,
what is happening here? So all that being said, dude, yeah, you got to come out to Lake Geneva. Let's hang out. You and Jen, we'll show you guys around and hang out in the digital room at Lakeland, and you can tell me everything that we're either doing right or wrong and how we can do it better. And I'll throw you into a VR headset since that's not your world. But
well, the next time we'll meet in my VR headset. Like my Oculus is around here somewhere. I don't know. I have one. I just don't use it very frequently.
That statement hurts my heart so much. It's around here somewhere.
Yeah, it is. I was using it. I was using it to prop up something for a while.
Oh,
so
no.
it was in its box, and it was sitting behind the couch that's behind me, and on a glass table. And then we were using it to prop up a 3D printed Destiny 2 gun that was in the backdrop of our shot, and it was sitting on top of the box that my headset is in. But I don't actually know. Actually, physically don't know where it is right now. It's somewhere in the room that I'm in, for sure.
Oh, it's okay. Our church.
I used to do meetings and stuff, man. We almost went to launch in alt space. Like, we almost launched an online service in alt space. We had a couple people who were passionate about it, and I literally logged into alt space and I looked at the upcoming events, and like 9 of them were church services, and I was like, someone has the corner over here. Like,
yeah,
I didn't need to. And of course, alt space, rip, it's not there. But but anyway, yeah, that's why one of the main reasons that we're not in is because there were so many churches who during COVID said, hey, VR seems like something we would like to do. That seems cutting edge, and like, let's go check it out. And they're not doing it nearly as well as what like Lakeland or even what Cornerstone Church is doing. You guys are like natives to it in many ways. But we went in and we're like, yeah, maybe not for us. Like, maybe there's other areas of the digital space that could also use churches, and maybe that's the direction that we're going to head in over the long haul.
Okay, this is the part of the podcast that it becomes really fun, because this is where everything, like the whole thing is unscripted, but this is where I start adding in stuff that I had never intended to bring in. And this is my podcast. I'm allowed to do it.
Yeah.
And as long as you're giving me your time to do it. So Lakeland is currently in a platform called Big Screen. And in the same way that you were talking about, like, hey, here are the 5 components that we see in Acts 2. Can we do this over here, over here, over here? There are so many what I call social VR platforms versus the gaming side of VR.
Mm-hmm.
And my mind automatically goes to, okay, how do we bring the expression of Lakeland? How do we bring a church expression into Rec Room, into VR Chat, into all the other platforms? All that being said, here's where something that maybe, since this is the potential Stu on this podcast mixed with the Metaverse Church podcast, here's this question: did you know that Big Screen has a Twitch component app mixed in with it?
You can kind of bring a Twitch stream directly into Big Screen, correct?
Yep, but it's an app that they already have built in. So
Okay.
unlike, instead of having to open up like a web browser and put in twitch.tv and then go find Lux or Jay or whatever, it is right there. Just like they have a YouTube button that you can just click on it, and then you can just search out right there and then bring it in, because that's what Big Screen is for. It's for the idea of sitting in community
Yeah,
up to
it's
15
movie theater.
people.
Yeah.
Yep. And just watch the streams, chat with each other, all that kind of stuff. So all that being said, Mr. Mark Lutz Digital, what's it gonna take? You've got VR people. What's it gonna take to get you guys to launch an expression in Big Screen?
So, my number. So what it would take is it would take a team that could actually disciple people in the platform that people are on. And my other initial reservation is if I throw my stream up on Big Screen and people pull it in, they can just stop in and watch it. How is that making what we're doing any different than the average physical church pastor who's standing up saying to a camera, welcome in online family, and then never noticing them again because they can't see them and those people cannot chat with them? And so
Mm.
I am hesitant to ever launch on a platform that I, as online a digital platform, that I, as the communicator, pastor, or anybody who's on the screen, cannot interact with in some capability the people who are actually there. Because the church now, I think that there's theoretically, it would be the only place that I would say we could have a campus pastor in Big Screen
Mhm.
who ministered to people in VR and then threw our live stream up on Wednesday night. Like, I would never do that on Facebook. I would never do that on YouTube. I theoretically could be stretched to do that on VR in Big Screen. That being said, the community of Twitch and the community of a VR community is different. I think that
Mm.
people just naturally associate them because you can play Beat Saber on VR. And so, like, well, this is for gamers. It isn't, though. The tech isn't there yet, right? And it's yet to be seen exactly what VR, AR, and MR are going to actually do in our lives, especially with the coming force that is sort of like AI and Gemini that just got announced from Google. And so I'm hesitant to say that we would adventure into VR in any way other than having a dedicated campus pastor that theoretically would teach and could interact with people in a healthy way. I think that Big Screen presents a unique opportunity because people are coming expecting to watch something, right?
Mhm.
Like, they're showing up with that expectation. And if you have people there to build relationship, great. But like, I still wouldn't do it just to do it. Like, if I did it, I would want a team of small group leaders. I would want an alpha digital group that's in it, right? I would want pastoral care people who are there to be able to offer counseling and minister to people. I would want a prayer team to be able to pray with people in rooms post Big Screen showing. I would want a place where we were channeling that community so that we were engaging with them more than just on the hour and a half to 2 hours that were live in Big Screen. That would be the place that we would connect, but then we would either have to build a second Discord server for the VR community, or we'd have to find a
Mm.
way to get them into a platform that we could engage with them all throughout the week and be able to do that really well. And so there's a lot more. Like, when I think about, is it easy to throw your live stream up in a whole bunch of places? It absolutely is. I have a multi-stream button on the software that we use. I can right now go to 3 or 4 places if I want to, and we intentionally only go to one. Not because I'm not concerned about reaching people. It's that I am concerned that I have to stand face to face with Jesus one day and explain why I was reaching people with no intention of discipling them. And so I am really hesitant to just branch out to new platforms simply because we can. And I think that most people in digital space should think about that more. Because the church just typically only thinks about reach, right? Because it's platform first, right? And if you're thinking relationship first, then the first question that you ask when you say, what if we go to this platform and start streaming there? The first question that you ask is you say, well, who's going to be there to meet with those people? Who's going to be there to care for those people? Who's going to be there to know their names and know their stories and be there with them when their kid's in the hospital? Who's going to be there with them and pray with them whenever they have to go in the hospital? Who's going to provide them with a meal through DoorDash despite being, maybe 12-hour drive away? These are all things that are staples inside of our church community and help people know that they're cared for and loved. And the moment that you just go away from that, right? The moment that you go away from that and you go to a platform-based ministry, people can go to any platform they want. So why are they watching you and not watching porn? Why are they watching you and not watching Groeschel preach? Why are they watching you and not watching Furtick preach? Right? Because as soon as you detach relationship from it and move to a platform-based ministry, you are no longer really being a church in many cases. Like you are being a live stream. You are being a goods and service, right? Like you are offering something to people. And so for me, my gut this is a long explanation to a rather simple question. My gut reaction is like, and I didn't really thought about that before, is like, man, if I cannot hear those people's stories, if I can't meet them where they are, if we don't have a robust team of people to minister to them and then offer them community and small groups and discipleship, I can't imagine us going there until we're ready to do all of that, to really be the church in the space that they're already in, instead of just being there and being like, hey, but if you really want to experience church, jump platforms. People don't jump platforms so they can go to church.
Yep. Very true. Well, I'll tell you what, whenever you guys think that you're ready to explore that, I'm more than happy to help in the process to get Lux set up in the VR spaces, because in the same way that the potential impact for what you guys are already doing, 171 million VR users. And the world needs more people with the heartbeat that you just so wonderfully expressed in that answer in those spaces. So, Mark, man, I am super thankful for you. I am so thankful that God has made our paths cross. And I can't wait to continue just advancing God's kingdom on this side of eternity with you and the many different platforms that we're at. So, dude, thank you for your time and thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, Stuart, thanks for having me on. It was great.